Let's see. And what's out of the prosecutor and the group that your attention is just the person that, right?
Just now. Is that okay? Okay.
But I assume some of that is the regulatory role that the state of California plays around money transmitter laws and that sort of thing. So it could fit inside this tiny little element called banking, but I'm wondering if that's a bigger issue and how much the public is expecting us to opine on that.
Yeah. Banking and taxes, I know, has also been raised as an issue and a question.
Let's take a couple of working with and then we'll call public comment. Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. I was just listening to all of these conversations here. One thing that I feel like if I was to, not if, we will be the reader of this, more from like the logical flow. Between section 2 and 3, there is that, we call it the cross-cutting layer that perhaps is missing, right? The things that would apply to all of these program area, regardless what you do. The readiness, the cybersecurity side of it, the transactional, the payment, whether you're paying for health benefit versus paying for, fishing license. I mean, I wonder if from the flow of this, we could come to some of a section that describe these foundational building blocks, which could speak to the readiness of it. And then based on the readiness, not only the foundational building block, but also which program area that actually best apply. And this would take into consider some, should be done at the government level, and some should be probably not done at the government level. And what are some of the evaluation criteria before we get into more of, potential application area? Because I feel like once we have the building block and the selection evaluation criteria and the consideration involved, then, the government entity could really say, this is my playbook to get to that point. And knowing that we literally have 10 cabinet agencies that bucket all of these functional areas, then that distribution could go out further, saying, how do you see this being, implemented in your area? And perhaps we stretch out a section more between 2 and 3 before we spend too much time on, describing the scenario.
What you do with setting up an evaluation methodology is that regardless of which specific application areas you're working on, there's always an opportunity to use that evaluation process for other areas outside of what you cover as a working group. And there's a value to that on its own.
Correct. I think it's just where, where we can, you're trying to do more with less, right? Where you could go into more of foundational building block that could take care of the cross-cutting issues. Let's do that holistically. But recognizing that all of these program areas have its uniqueness, and how do you deal with that uniqueness, you got to be very methodical about. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all to say thou shalt use everything on this. I think just having that very careful, a deliberate process involved will be a good guideline for the government to implement.
And so I think then to piggyback off this readiness point, right? And then I also think just to emphasize some points Arshad right, made earlier. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Arshad is fine. Thank you.
I do think the blockchain itself is really a tool, but I think it would actually be useful to have something in the report, especially when we think about whether certain agencies are ready to use this technology is around data and whether data sources are reliable. Because I think the other potential not danger, but risk of the blockchain is that if you essentially have fraudulent data or bad data that goes in, it's sort of there permanently. And so then how does one address the risk if bad data gets in there? And I guess more importantly, as a threshold matter, how do you prevent bad data from even getting introduced?
If I may just use an analogy to the building and construction industry, when discussing potential application areas, we're talking about what type of furnishings or what type of appliances and what color of paint and carpet we want inside the building. But what we should be talking about are how secure is the foundation? What about the frames? What about the beams? I think we all know what happened to the transit center in San Francisco recently. So without that kind of conversation and without that analysis, I think talking about the software furnishings of a new building is a little premature. So I would agree with Amy over there that there needs to be some section here that says you must have a certain foundation before you get to that part.
Liz.
Liz, sorry. But I was agreeing with Amy also. She used the word foundation blocks.
Any other comments, suggestions?
So, can I just say one last thing? I do think, to that point, I do think that there is a regulatory response to this technology that could shepherd it along and nurture it and help it blossom and grow, or that could crush it. And I do think it would be remiss if we didn't address that, even at a high level. What kinds of regulations inadvertently could just really staunch the innovation in this space in a way that would actually be detrimental to citizens of the state of California. So I don't really see that captured here, but I think it is important.
Yeah, to add to that point, I think, Sheila, that's a great point. We should make sure that there are regulations that stifle innovation. I think we also have to think about regulatory proposals that could propose, that could help enable innovation, enable uptake. I think there's a ton of ideas there. I have some, sure I just have some about things we could do, like even sort of turbocharge this. So.
I mean, are we with each of these application areas looking at, are we emissary from the planet blockchain, kind of describing how the rest of the world has used it and what are the interesting things and maybe one day, or are we trying to analyze the situation in California around each of these items, around health records, around CCPA, the California, what's the Consumer Privacy Act, right? Kind of the GDPR, like how does it align with these? For each of these, should we be coming up with like ideas or recommendations specific to California? Or is this still intended to just be kind of a survey of the landscape?
I think for the legislation, we're supposed to be coming up with recommendations that can be informed by experiences elsewhere or other research and knowledge that we have. But I think it should be forward-looking and be guidance for the legislators and others who are doing business in the state. One other question I had perhaps to consider including is about how to communicate about blockchain, maybe toward the end, like what is the message about blockchain? I think a lot of people are still quite unfamiliar with it or suspicious of it or just have a lot of questions about it. And is it, that's a question, is it the place of this report also to help provide some guidance about how to communicate with constituents and California citizens or residents about it? Or just trust the legislators and agencies?
I guess it comes back to the audience for this report. Everything's publicly available, presumably, and so I do think it could be helpful to maybe have like a reading list or bibliography of some kind for other people who might not be able to access meaningfully the information in the report. But it seems to me that's not quite the mandate of the group, and maybe some general thematic suggestions about what kinds of materials might be most useful without creating them ourselves.
That's a good idea, like recommended resources or something like that.
Well, I remember when we first started that one of the principles was about engagement and accessibility. So maybe just making remarks about that and suggestions would be important for that in terms of communication.
And it is such a fast-moving field too. As soon as we publish anything, there's going to be many more things to read. So
that was my point. I like the idea of having it be accessible and readable, not just to legislators, but to members of the public.
Yeah.
But our reading list, if it's on a website that we can modify every 6 months, then I think it would be a very effective and useful resource, not just for people in California, but frankly for other states that are considering their own blockchain laws. But that's a heavy burden to be doing that.
Can I make a comment on one of the previous points?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So why don't we take a break and do some comments? Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah,
Thank
so I've just been studying the SEC framework around tokens as well as other states, and I was reading the minutes from Wyoming's blockchain task force. I just wanted to point out to what Brian was saying earlier that it's not the state's role to look at cryptocurrencies. Well, they brought it up in their meeting, and the state of, in their task force decided that it was the state's ruling, and they're coming up with their own tokenization laws. So I guess one of the questions that I wanted to kind of like see how you guys answer over these next 9 months is how you see yourselves like working within federal law or as part of federal law, or how you see that like that collaboration, since other states are also kind of bucking that federal law as well.
Any other public comments?
Kai wanted to get some input.
Kai, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess just read the outline, and I don't know if we've moved on from that yet, but I think that there's like an interesting question about which things we address in the subsections and which things we pull out. So for example, the sort of like risks and benefits. I could imagine the risks and benefits of doing voting on the blockchain are very different than the risks and benefits of doing tax preparation, tax payments on the blockchain. And I think likewise the suggestion of sort of case studies of successful implementation or of failed implementation. I don't know if we would want to do like an upfront section on here's an example of it going well, or 3 examples of it going well, and here's 3 examples of a government entity, like sort of what not to do if you're starting a blockchain project. And I guess maybe like as we bullet out the subsections, we'll sort of see, is everybody covering cybersecurity the same way, and we should just pull out security and privacy as a separate section. But I guess I wanted to flag that up front.
Great, good idea, thank you. Other thoughts about the contents of the report? We don't have to answer every single question today, right? This is an iterative process, but I want to have at least an initial conversation.
One other comment, I really want to echo the point that it's already too many reading material out there that becomes stale the minute you have it out there. And the last thing we want after all of this time is spent is to become another shelfware document that probably have 2 days of life and then, outdated. And so it's more of a question that it's a guideline, it's a information that we provide. Even if the example of citing other success or not so successful story, those are not necessarily part of the document, but probably more of a reference material, because those, evolve even much faster. So is there a thought about, how do we even structure this where the portion meant to be more fluid and then therefore would actually encourage this to be a living document, so you've written that way? In some section, if it's a recommendation for regulation change or create new regulation, that probably will be a longer term aspect. So I was just curious whether, we thought about it from that way as well.
I think acknowledging that we're going to be writing this in a point in time. In the one question I had is, I think these tend to be more useful if there are real actionable. We can make recommendations that are actionable and specific. And so one question is, to the extent that we identify things where we think it's a really good use case and there's a certain degree of readiness, or there's a but-for question, if there is something that is within state purview, either regulatory or current law, where we think there's a change could allow the but-for to happen, I think that would be really useful to point out and be very specific around that and why, right? So I guess in terms of this sort of where we go in recommendations, I think that could be very helpful in kind of this becoming a living document in the sense that it then gets used.
Yeah, the public comment?
Sure. So my comment / question is around, or it's about to be around after I'm practicing this, around conflicts of law and the structure of the report, and then definitions and all. But foremost, thanks for being here. I'm happy that you guys have volunteered your time, and I'm proud of who's this guy. So when we mentioned cannabis or other additional items to be listed, I started thinking to myself about how the current conflict between like the consumer, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, or the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, those currently have or offer a right to ratification or erasure, or known as the right to be forgotten. But then there's, at least in CCPA, there's like 9 different exceptions. All the GDPR doesn't have that. I was thinking to myself, oh wow, they did a really good job because most of these fall in one of those exceptions. And when Liz mentioned the immutability of blockchain, I thought to myself, well, that would be really scary for a private corporation that doesn't fall into one of these exceptions. How are they possibly going to adhere or comply with a right to rectification or erasure to be forgotten? So I don't know the answer to that question. I don't even know if the blockchain is always going to be immutable, because I don't understand encryption at that level yet. And then I just wanted to touch on a distributed ledger. And I was hoping that you might chime in, Brian, but somebody mentioned about how you make a choice when you use the blockchain, when you don't use it, and do you want it to be distributed amongst many nodes. So my concern was all the different definitions of distributed. And there's controversy around how many nodes qualify as being distributed. And then you get into security versus privacy. So my last comment before I be quiet is, I'm concerned that during this 9 months, you might be in danger of not addressing as much as you need to address if you do not also address data privacy and security. Because even when HIPAA was written, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, they have a privacy rule and a security rule. They don't try to get at it all in one bit. And that's pretty much all. Then the last point I mentioned in my preface was structure. I imagine, I think it was Kay on the phone, said something about benefits and risks and then cautions and legal implications, but I imagine that attacking each one of these would be of high benefit to whoever's consuming your report, because in fact, the benefits and risks of blockchain for taxation or land use and title would definitely be different than others. So those are my comments. Thanks for those considerations.
Thank you.
On the first 2 points, I think the intro to blockchain should definitely cover the full spectrum from permissionless and kind of cryptocurrency-oriented networks to permissioned and private networks, and some of the trade-offs and such. There's a lot that's written out there publicly about it, so a lot of this can be a bibliography of pointing to resources about that, but even still crisply helping regulators, legislators, and the public understand that, I think would be a useful way to spend a few paragraphs. And I think that will start to deal with some of the questions about what does decentralized mean, what does distributed mean, because those are recurring topics. I believe that, I'll double down on my suggestion that we have a section on digital identity, even separate for application area. And I believe in that section, we could have that cover how do you do digital identity and really personal information management in a manner using an immutable ledger, but in a manner that can be compliant with these different regulations. Again, lots has been written about that. We can farm out, but spend a few paragraphs on that, and I think advance understanding.
I would echo like all that on the second part. I think having a section on digital identity is good. I think it's possible to talk about ways of addressing privacy regulation, like the French Data Protection Authority has come out with some very helpful guidance. There are ways of doing digital IDs and tying those from information blockchain from the identity that allows you to do some really interesting things in a way that is still GDPR compliant, just to pick one privacy law, or CCPA compliant to pick another one. So.
Anything else, especially to the legislative staff? I think probably you will be one of the key audiences for this report, and so I want to make sure it's especially useful for you all, and wondered if you had any comments on how the report, how we're thinking about it so far.
Well, I thought that 9 months is not enough time for us to actually complete the task at hand. I'm just trying to go along and see what I can report back to my boss.
I mean, from going through 2 years of working on these pieces of legislation, I worked with Mr. Calderon's office when I was in Senator Hertzberg's office. When we had companion bills, there was the working group, and ours was the stock certificates. And I think that my feeling is that the legislative body, both committee consultants, legislative staff, the legislators themselves, when they look at this, what we're doing here is exactly that. Within each of these individual areas, A through G and beyond, what did we observe in these areas? Where do we say, yes, we should go into records management with this. No, we shouldn't go into vehicles registration on this sort of things. What were the pros and cons? What are the risks out there? Because I think that this is a very new technology to a lot of people down the road here who, and some people are excited and some people are very cautious. And I think that is a balance of what I'm seeing here today. And some committee members are very passionate about this. Some people are very cautious about this new technology. So I think that there's a lot of eyes on what this report will report as far as the different topics and what sort of guidance will this report suggest to the legislature for probably actions as soon as, laws to go into effect January 1, 2021. I would assume that there's going to be a handful of recommendations that come out of this report that can turn into legislation next summer and enacted that following January if we complete our report on time.
Go ahead.
So this is perhaps more organizational. Something to consider maybe fairly early on describing a future, I don't want to say state, but not capital state. Sort of here's what things could look like in these areas if we use this technology effectively. And then go from there into the, kind of the more, there's the tutorial section and there's the what's required to get it done, et cetera. So it's just an organizational thought.
So just looking at the outline that you have up there, right, I think, and especially if Bobby's talking about, potentially, proposing legislation next, as early as next summer. I mean, I do think the point that Sheila made earlier around having a sort of, clear regulatory framework or guidance, I do think it may make sense for that to be one of the topic areas, right? And by that I mean, and I think one of the public commenters mentioned earlier, the Wyoming's regulatory framework. I mean, I do think one of the opportunities of this group here and of this project, right, is for California to put forth a clear, principled regulatory framework that will attract and keep these types of businesses and jobs in California. Because I think those of us in the private sector, we do actually see other states, other countries putting forth very attractive, clear frameworks that, essentially, make California less competitive.
So just to clarify, you suggesting that would be something on front, or maybe more part of that additional section around regulation, and maybe it's regulation and guidance. Do you think it's a product of all the discussions around application areas, or do you think that drives that discussion?
I actually think it should go in the front, and the reason is because it's hard to talk about and really get into the meat of any of the use cases when you don't know the business environment and the rules that you'll need to be operating in.
So a lot of these application areas are more heavily focused on the public sector. Not to say the private industry isn't also involved in many of them, but is there a way that you would recommend calling out private enterprise specifically, or in some way, or is it better to have it still broken out by sector,
Well, I mean, I think,
industry or health industry or whatever?
yeah, I mean, I think the uses may be by some government agencies, but presumably the creators of necessary technology, right, will be in the private sector. And I also think, there's some really baseline questions where there's currently not a lot of consistency, between states, between agencies, between countries around taxonomy and so forth. And I think these are sort of some areas where it would actually be very helpful for California to weigh in on.
Any other thoughts about that?
Question, if I may. I have a research assistant currently pulling all the state current, and this is academia, right, so I can do this. He's pulling together for me all of the specific state statutes that have already been drafted and the states that are actually brainstorming statutes at this time. I think that might be helpful. I'm happy to share it. I'll send it to Gabby. But I'm happy to share it because I think eventually it would be useful for us to see what other states are doing if we're trying to position California in a competitive way.
Yeah.
And Michelle, if I could add to that, I mean, I would actually say California, I really think of it on a global stage. I mean, California is the world's 5th largest economy. And so really it's not really like a difference between like California and another state. Oftentimes now, especially given global mobility of talent, it's really California versus, and I think somebody mentioned earlier, Switzerland, right, Crypto Valley, et cetera, and some other countries. Yeah. So if your students actually have research on those other countries, I think that would actually be useful as well.
Other countries as well.
Yeah.
Sure.
I know Wyoming and Illinois have examples that I'm sure others are coming up as well. North Carolina, I think, has some.
New Jersey, they're doing what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And while your research assistant's doing that development, I know it's possible to pull the definitions from the respective states. I know when we were constructing the definitions that got inevitably codified, we were also, that's why I think it's one of the first descriptors, is have the group look at if there's a more perfect definition to be had. There was a lot of different statutes that were enacted at the time in different states or being considered when we developed the definition that was codified. And we thought that it was something that was appropriate for this working group's review to see if there's something better. Yep.
Any reason procedurally or just as a bad idea to be looking at like things that might be considered in the next legislative cycle? You know, report will be delivered halfway through, right? And I think there's something on cannabis and banks. I forget the number of the bill that sounds like it'll be in development for the next season. I'm just wondering if like we should stay away from opining or driving recommendations around that, or if in fact that's encouraged.
I mean, just from my experience in the legislature this year, I think there's a respective armistice between the houses to see the groups finish its work before they allow such bills to begin moving forward. And I only say that from experience. So.
Yeah, I think it's important to comment on upcoming legislation, or at least frame some of our discussions around the themes in that legislation. Because I'm sure they will be referencing and looking towards the guidance in the document as it comes up.
And that's actually one of the charges that the group is asked to do, the last one, in terms of looking at other related legislation.
I was going to say, I think it's useful just to, a lot of legislation takes multiple cycles to kind of get through. And so it's useful to comment. Sometimes I've seen other kind of work groups like this do something that's, if it's particularly time sensitive and maybe they don't want it in the body of a kind of foundational report, it's something that has a lot of currency, maybe it's just as it's an appendix, right? So legislation related to the like 1920, 2021, something like that, that gives it can be kind of thought of as a little bit separate and particularly current to a moment of time, but doesn't take away from the rest of the report's longevity. So that's a way to just think about framing it, because I do agree, I mean, if there are things that are really, this is sort of the one formal chance to put something forward, so it's useful to kind of put that in, and it can be done in a way that's not like, you guys are crazy if you do it this way right now. Maybe if there's not enough time to deliberate in the legislature, someone will say, let's hold it and reintroduce it. That, that's just kind of just the nature of how it happens, so. Circle back with Tasha.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of that input. That's really very valuable. So coming back to the conversation that we had earlier today about how we're going to accomplish all of this, seeing sort of the scope and scale of what we want to address, I want to invite your thoughts about, do you want to create subcommittees, and if so, which, and would you like to sign up to work on a particular topic, or would you like me or others, the agency, to suggest who might work on particular topics, or I'm open to your suggestions. I also appreciate Meredith's comment about trying to kind of equalize the scale of the topics, because there might be some that are perhaps broader or at a different stage than others. So I think that's something that we can try to calibrate maybe as we go along. What's your thinking about how to accomplish this task, and who wants to sign up?
Thank you. You know, it was a great discussion, and listening to it, I mean, there seem to be several opportunities for subcommittees, like, you know, clearly there's a set of interest around digital identity, there's a set of interest around policy recommendations. I bring those up because, like, those ones I talked about, those are two that I'd be interested in doing. Can you set up subcommittees on those? But they're clearly, look, I signed up to this to do work. I'm more than happy to do work, right? There are, you know, there clearly are some around sort of cybersecurity, around definition of blockchain, and others. And so I think actually you'd end up with sort of quite a few. I always think it's helpful when people have expressed interest, but I also think it's important to make sure we have a diversity of views, and perhaps some oversight from you or from GovOps to make sure that there's an appropriate diversity of views on any sort of particular subgroup is valuable as well. But yes, if we did those two, I would definitely want to volunteer for those two.
And some of this can also come out in your individual conversations with Ori, as she's going to schedule them over the next several weeks.
Two comments. I would like to volunteer to research the tool that I mentioned the World Wide Web Consortium uses to see if it might comply with the Bagley-Keene law and bring it to Vienna for adjudication or for her formal response on that. The second thing, I think by now it's probably clear, I would like to be part of the cybersecurity subgroup. And as much as I would welcome the opportunity to work with anyone who is interested in security, I think it may benefit the work group best if I work with someone who is the most rabid proponent of blockchain, so that I could balance that enthusiasm with a little bit of caution with what I've seen over the last 20 years.
I just wanted to make a quick clarification on subcommittees, because earlier we talked about writing of subcommittees or working groups that would be writing something. Another approach is also for the subcommittees to conduct either open meetings if it's 3 or more, or research amongst themselves and discussions, and then report back to this work group as a future agenda items before you write something. So just because you're in a subcommittee doesn't mean you have to write anything. You could just do a lot of research and discuss with the public and experts or whoever, and then write sort of an oral report, a presentation. That's it.
Yeah, that's good to know. And also to note that Ori and her group is also available to help with a report writing task. So, you know, whatever input we receive from you, that could be notes, PowerPoint presentations, or, you know, other forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole narrative that we'll take on the work, you know, among us of trying to compile that and harmonize all of that.
As part of the process, I'd love to try to find a way to engage the public in the collection of these examples. Because I mean, that's a lot of groundwork to do, and especially since reaching in and getting data, it might be beyond us as individuals, but somebody who's in the middle of a project on this might be in a better position to do that. So I feel like if we came up with a template for those examples and kind of some guidance on really what are we looking for in those examples, both metrics, understand like what level they're at, and then what might be emergent recommendations coming out of that for the state of California. We might be able to really effectively leverage people beyond this panel to be able to help write so much of the report for us.
Yeah, I like that crowdsourcing.
A bit. I mean, with us as in an editorial role.
Sure, understandable.
And actually creating some kind of a guideline or criteria to what examples we want to use is not just for the public, but it's appropriate for the working group. We have to have some kind of a understanding of what is relevant to this that we, and isn't in the kind of format and providing sufficient information and validity that we want to include. And so we haven't actually talked about the criteria that we want to set for information sharing and providing examples. How do we decide that something is valid and appropriate to include?
Yeah, I think we can take in as many examples as we want. It's just that what then might we share as examples that has a kind of informatory of what we're trying out at the end.
So I'm actually going to add that question to the assessment interviews, because I think this is a really important question to ask all of you in terms of how do you develop and what needs to be on such a template of collecting examples for this process. Thank you.
And maybe, I don't know, the legislative staff can offer some guidance too. I have seen open forum kind of committees where people have convened panels of experts, or what other ways do you get information from your stakeholders that's been useful?
Just from a public forum, a panel style type forum has been very helpful in the past, and I have received a few phone calls and inquiries from the public about their interest in participating if they could.
Okay.
And so that's another aspect that we can look into.
And so then if they have an article or a report or something, how do they send that to you?
Old-fashioned email.
Okay. Good.
I concur with what you said.
Okay. Great.
I also want to concur. We rely on expert testimony all the time in crafting legislation. They come present to us, they send us things, they make the case.
Okay.
There are a number of such reports, and people are compiling these all the time where they're collecting use cases and whatnot, and some of them aren't done. But there's a bunch of these that have come up in impact use cases, function use cases. So I imagine it would not be a huge challenge to either get someone who co-authored those reports or even the kind of main lead author on those reports to give us some time.
Great. Well, maybe we can think about that as part of the process, is to have some kind of public hearing where we invite others to come and present. I want to constrain it probably to some of the specific areas that we're really interested in, because there is so much work going on in blockchain. I wouldn't want it to be too wide open as to the topic. But I think the way that we have laid it out with your good suggestions about the kind of matrix or the guiding principles, foundational principles up front, and then looking at the use cases and then the evaluation and recommendations at the end, that was a very helpful discussion. Other thoughts before we conclude? Marie will be in touch with you to have some one-on-one conversations. And then we'll also be in touch about the scheduling. So we definitely plan to anticipate at least the number of public meetings that we had discussed already, but likely more, whether that is going to be in subcommittee meetings or as a full group or some creative combination of those. We'll try to figure out what's going to work best for everyone.
Well, just a reminder with regard to the onboarding materials, that you need to send the signed documents. And we will be working on updating the table of contents based on the conversation that we had today, and think through process and how to incorporate the subgroup work into the larger working group, and information sharing will be things that we're going to be looking into after the meeting.
I just had a thought there. When it comes to the work of a subcommittee, should we, any one of us get placed on that subcommittee, and I don't know if this is a council question or whatnot, can we encourage the inclusion of somebody to come and testify at that subcommittee, or how will that process be designed? Like, for instance, if somebody thinks, oh, well, this is a topic that Department of Business Oversight should be involved in because it oversees banking regulation in the state of California, can we recommend that? Are we allowed to ask them to come, or would that go through staff, or how would that best?
Typically, that's best done through staff. There's no limitation on how many outside entities or the public can be involved. So if one of you has a suggestion for a particular topic, let's say security, you want to discuss A, B, and C, and then item D on the agenda would be a presentation by a particular person or group, you just would let Gabby know, and she would coordinate with that person to present at the next meeting or at your subcommittee meeting or however, yeah. So discussing directly with staff would be the best way.
And to clarify, is Gabby kind of our Twitter? Like, if we have messages that we want to get out to the rest of the group as well as the public, right? Like I've got, like let's start with bibliography. I think we can start. I'm sure everybody has like 5 articles they can think of that they think would be responsive to this. And as part of our collective sense making, to start with, it might be good to kind of for each of us to share up to 5 kind of things that we think others should or could benefit from reading.
So, oh, go ahead.
Since you mentioned Twitter, there was a section in the member handbook, I think, about if we get approached by the media to defer most things that are substantive to, I think, Camille or the staff. Could you maybe elaborate on examples and what you would recommend in terms of it? It's a little bit unfriendly to say, I can't say a thing about this, talk to the chair, right?
No, I think we can be flexible about that. I just wanted to offer myself as a spokesperson. If you do get approached, I mean, obviously you're all experts in blockchain, and if there are questions about blockchain in general or in your particular area, then certainly feel free. But if there are specific questions about that output of the working group and that process, then feel free to direct it to me or to go through the staff, and we'll direct it appropriately.
So as a follow-on to that, Camille, I understand that the working group's mechanics should certainly be deferred to the chair or the staff. But what about opinions that the individual members have about blockchain or any of the technical things that are being, because this is a highly technical topic and everybody who's in this field is an expert. So if people are asked to opine about that, what are the rules here?
Well, there's 2 considerations. If you're applying, if you're asked about your opinion in your personal capacity as whatever practice area you represent, that would be fine. If you're being asked, what does the work group think about a specific topic, then you would want to defer to Camille or someone else, because that's kind of inputting the consensus that you haven't quite formed yet in your open meeting and presenting as a representative of the work group. So that's a little tougher than just your personal opinion.
So even a personal opinion on blockchain itself would be okay?
Right, yeah, in your own capacity.
Okay. Thank you.
We were talking on this side of, about getting a photo potentially of the first meeting of the blockchain.
Yes.
So I just in terms of just getting back to next steps, I want to say that given that this is the kickoff meeting, we knew that we were coming into this meeting with not everything as far as the process completely formulated, and that was intentional because we want to get your input into how as a group you want to work together and the content that you want to develop together. And so the assessment interviews are going to be particularly important to help us take the input that we received from you today and the interview, and then come back to you at the next meeting with more well-defined process. And one thing that we haven't even discussed today has to do with decision making and reaching consensus, and that would really be important for us to come back to before we even get into the content discussion. So just a reminder to please help me find time with you to have these conversations so we can be fully prepared to get into the process in our next meeting.
Thank you. And I like the idea of the photo, but I think we can adjourn our formal meeting. And if you all have a few minutes to take a photo, then that would be great. Thank you again for your time and expert input.